August 4, 1962, Marilyn Monroe's Brentwood home, 10:47 p.m. On the nightstand beside her bed, beneath the bottles of Nembutal and chloral hydrate, FBI agents would later find a single page, a film treatment, handwritten notes in the margins, Frank Sinatra's name circled 3 times, the project title, The Arrangement, a romantic thriller about a fading movie star and a nightclub singer caught between the mob and the White House, the film that would have reunited Hollywood's most explosive pairing, the film that studio executives had spent 6 months secretly developing, the film that 3 different intelligence agencies had flagged as politically dangerous, the film that died with Marilyn that night, taking with it the truth about why 2 legends were never allowed to share the screen. For 62 years, Hollywood insiders whispered about The Arrangement, the movie that could have saved Marilyn's career, exposed Washington's darkest secrets, and changed cinema history forever. But someone made sure that script would never reach production. Someone powerful enough to silence a studio. Someone connected enough to make FBI files disappear. Someone who understood that putting Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra together in 1962 wasn't just dangerous for their careers, it was dangerous for the presidency itself. Before we continue this story, subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover about Hollywood's most dangerous unmade film has never been told this way before. The story of The Arrangement began in Frank Sinatra's Palm Springs compound in late January 1962. Marilyn had been staying there intermittently since her divorce from Arthur Miller, seeking refuge from the pressure of her faltering career and her increasingly complicated relationship with the Kennedy brothers. One evening, after most of Sinatra's Rat Pack entourage had left, Frank sat down at his piano with a treatment written by screenwriter George Axelrod, the same man who had adapted The 7-Year Itch for the screen. The film would tell the story of a movie star named Diana Spencer, a barely disguised Marilyn Monroe, who becomes romantically entangled with a nightclub singer named Johnny Fortune, clearly modeled on Sinatra himself. But the real plot, the dangerous plot, centered on Diana's affair with a charismatic senator running for president and the organized crime figures who controlled both the entertainment industry and the political machine that would elevate that senator to the White House. It wasn't just fiction, it was a confession wrapped in a screenplay. Sinatra knew immediately that this script could either resurrect both their careers or destroy them completely, and he also knew that the people it would expose, from Sam Giancana to the Kennedy brothers themselves, would never allow it to reach theaters. Marilyn arrived at the compound the next morning, and Frank showed her the treatment. For 3 hours they sat in his music room discussing the project. Peter Lawford, who was present for part of that conversation, would later tell investigators that Marilyn's reaction surprised everyone. She didn't reject it. She didn't fear it. Instead, she saw it as an opportunity to control her own narrative, to tell the truth about what Hollywood and Washington had done to her, without actually naming names. She made notes in the margins of the script, changes to dialogue, suggestions for scenes, emotional beats that only someone who had lived through the experiences could understand. By the time she left that afternoon, both she and Sinatra had agreed to bring the project to 20th Century Fox, where Marilyn was still under contract, despite being fired from Something's Got to Give just weeks earlier. They believed that the studio, desperate for a hit and aware of the box office potential of pairing 2 megastars, would greenlight the project despite its controversial subject matter. What they didn't understand was that 20th Century Fox was already under federal scrutiny, and the last thing studio executives wanted was a film that would invite more attention from Washington. Peter Levathes, the head of 20th Century Fox in 1962, was a man caught between competing pressures. The studio was hemorrhaging money on Cleopatra, and Marilyn Monroe had just been fired from Something's Got to Give for chronic absences. The studio needed a hit desperately, and a Sinatra-Monroe project could be exactly that kind of commercial salvation. But Levathes was also receiving calls, quiet, unofficial calls from people who didn't identify themselves but made it clear they represented interests that extended far beyond Hollywood. When the arrangement treatment landed on his desk in early March 1962, hand-delivered by Sinatra's manager Jack Entratter, Levathes read it once and immediately understood why those calls had started coming. The script wasn't subtle. The senator character, despite being named Richard Grayson in the treatment, was obviously John F. Kennedy, right down to his Boston accent and his war hero background. The nightclub singer's connections to organized crime mirrored Sinatra's documented relationships with Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante, and the movie star's tragic arc, her destruction by the very men who claimed to love her, was Marilyn's story told with almost documentary precision. If this film were made, if Marilyn and Frank spoke these words on camera, the implications would be impossible to ignore. Levithes scheduled a meeting with Marilyn and Sinatra for March 15, 1962. According to studio records, it lasted less than 20 minutes. Levithes opened by acknowledging the script's power and commercial potential, but then pivoted to the concerns raised by the studio's legal department. He didn't mention the phone calls from Washington or the veiled threats about federal investigations into the studio's tax practices. He didn't mention that FBI Director Edgar Hoover had personally reached out to one of Fox's major investors to express concern about projects that might compromise national security. Instead, Levithes focused on the practical. The script would need major revisions, the senator character would need to be completely reimagined, and the organized crime elements would need to be softened or removed entirely. Marilyn, according to Lawford's later testimony, understood immediately what was happening. She stood up, told Levithes that the script's power came from its honesty, and that if Fox wouldn't make it as written, she would take it to another studio. Sinatra tried to negotiate, suggesting they could make some changes while preserving the emotional core of the story. But Levithes had already made his decision. Before they left his office, he told them that Fox would not be producing the arrangement under any circumstances, and that he strongly advised them not to shop the project elsewhere. When Marilyn asked why, Levithes simply said, "Because some stories are too dangerous to tell, even in Hollywood." What Marilyn and Sinatra didn't know was that the Kennedy brothers had been monitoring the arrangement project since its inception. FBI surveillance of Marilyn's phone calls, authorized by J. Edgar Hoover and conducted without official warrant, had captured her conversations with Sinatra about the script as early as February 19. Transcripts of those calls were delivered directly to Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who immediately understood the threat the film represented. Bobby Kennedy had already begun distancing the administration from Marilyn, cutting off the affair that had followed his brother's own romantic entanglement with the actress. But a film that depicted, even fictionally, the reality of those relationships would undo all of that careful separation. More dangerously, it would expose the Kennedy family's connections to organized crime figures like Sam Giancana, connections that had been instrumental in delivering crucial votes in the 1960 election. Bobby called a meeting with his brother at the White House on March 18, just 3 days after Marilyn's confrontation with Lawford. No official record of that meeting exists, but multiple Kennedy administration insiders later confirmed that the president and his attorney general discussed the Marilyn problem and agreed that the film could not be allowed to proceed. The Kennedy brothers' strategy was multifaceted and ruthless. Robert Kennedy reached out personally to several major studio heads, including Jack Warner and Darryl Zanuck, making it clear that any studio that produced the arrangement would face federal investigation into their business practices and their compliance with antitrust regulations. The message was received and understood. Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra were now untouchable for this project. Second, the administration used its influence with the Motion Picture Association of America to ensure that even if the film were independently produced, it would face severe censorship challenges under the production code. Third, and most devastatingly, Bobby Kennedy used his personal relationship with Peter Lawford to pressure Sinatra directly. Lawford, caught between his loyalty to the Rat Pack and his position as the Kennedys' brother-in-law, delivered a message to Frank in late March. If the arrangement moved forward, Sinatra would be completely cut off from the Kennedy circle, his FBI file would be reviewed for possible criminal connections, and his gambling licenses in Nevada would face immediate challenge. For Sinatra, who had built his Las Vegas empire on those licenses, the choice was clear. He called Marilyn on March 27 and told her that he was withdrawing from the project. The conversation, captured by FBI wiretaps, lasted 8 minutes. Marilyn cried, Frank apologized, and the film that could have saved her life died that night on a recorded phone line. But Marilyn Monroe refused to let the project die. In the weeks following Sinatra's withdrawal, she became obsessed with finding a way to make the arrangement without studio support, without Sinatra, without the entire Hollywood infrastructure that had betrayed her. She reached out to independent producers, to foreign film companies, even to documentary filmmakers. She contacted John Frankenheimer, the director who had just completed The Manchurian Candidate, a film that dealt explicitly with political conspiracy. Frankenheimer was initially intrigued, but after a single phone call from an unnamed government liaison, he withdrew his interest. Marilyn tried Elia Kazan, who had directed her in The Misfits. Kazan told her honestly that no director in Hollywood would touch the material, and that her pursuit of the project was professional suicide and possibly worse. By late April 1962, Marilyn's obsession with the arrangement had become known throughout Hollywood, and the industry's response was unanimous. She had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too willing to expose secrets that powerful people wanted buried. Her phone calls went unreturned. Her agents stopped representing her interests. Even her closest friends began avoiding her. The isolation drove Marilyn deeper into the prescription drug dependency that had plagued her for years. Her consumption of Nembutal and chloral hydrate increased dramatically between April and July 1962, and her psychiatric sessions with Dr. Ralph Greenson became more frequent and more desperate. Greenson's notes from this period, released decades after his death, reveal an actress in psychological crisis, convinced that powerful forces were conspiring to silence her, paranoid about phone taps and surveillance, and increasingly fixated on the idea that telling her story was the only way to reclaim her dignity. Greenson tried to convince her that the film project was a dangerous fantasy, but Marilyn had moved beyond career considerations. For her, the arrangement had become something larger than a film. It was proof that she was more than the image Hollywood had created, that her experiences mattered, and that the truth about power and corruption in America deserved to be told. She spent hours rewriting the script, incorporating details that only she knew, adding scenes that dramatized specific incidents from her affairs with the Kennedy brothers, her friendships with mob-connected figures, and her exploitation by studio executives. By June 1962, she had a complete screenplay, 127 pages, typed on her personal typewriter with corrections in her handwriting. She made 3 copies. One she kept in her home, one she sent to Sinatra with a note begging him to reconsider, and one she gave to an unnamed friend with instructions to make the script public if anything happened to her. That 3rd copy has never been found. The last weekend of July 1962, just 1 week before Marilyn's death, brought all the players together at Cal-Neva Lodge, the casino on Lake Tahoe that Sinatra co-owned with Sam Giancana. Marilyn arrived on Friday, July 27th, looking exhausted and frail. Frank Sinatra was already there, hosting Peter Lawford and several other Rat Pack associates. Sam Giancana, despite being officially banned from Nevada casinos due to his organized crime connections, was also present, staying in one of the private bungalows. The official story describes this weekend as a final attempt by Sinatra to cheer up his depressed friend, but testimony from Cal-Neva employees, FBI surveillance reports, and later interviews tell a much darker story. This wasn't a vacation, it was a confrontation. Sinatra had arranged the weekend specifically to convince Marilyn to abandon the arrangement permanently, and he had brought Giancana because the mob boss had his own reasons for wanting the project killed. Giancana's criminal empire relied on maintaining relationships with political figures like the Kennedys, and a film that exposed those relationships would bring federal scrutiny his organization couldn't afford. On Saturday night, July 28th, a confrontation occurred in one of the Cal-Neva bungalows. The details remain disputed, but multiple sources confirm that Marilyn, Sinatra, Lawford, and Giancana were all present. Voices were raised, threats were made. Marilyn, heavily sedated and emotionally fragile, reportedly became hysterical, screaming that she would expose everyone, that she would tell the truth about the Kennedys, about Sinatra's mob connections, about everything. Sinatra tried to calm her down. Lawford attempted to mediate. But Giancana, according to later testimony, delivered an ultimatum. You make that movie, you talk about what you know, and you won't live to see it released. This isn't Hollywood politics, sweetheart. This is real, and real has consequences you don't survive. Marilyn left Cal-Neva early Sunday morning, driven back to Los Angeles by a Cal-Neva employee who later reported that she cried the entire 3-hour drive. She arrived at her Brentwood home around noon on July 29th. For the next 6 days, she made a series of phone calls to friends, to her psychiatrist, to Robert Kennedy, and to several journalists. Friends who spoke with her during this period reported that she seemed simultaneously terrified and determined, convinced that she was in danger, but unwilling to back down. On Friday, August 3rd, she called a reporter at the Los Angeles Times and said, "I'm going to tell everything. About the Kennedys, about Frank, about all of them. They think they can threaten me into silence, but I'm done being controlled. If something happens to me, make sure people know why." 24 hours later, Marilyn Monroe was dead. The official cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning, with the manner listed as probable suicide, but the circumstances contained so many irregularities that conspiracy theories began circulating within hours and have never stopped. The timeline was problematic. Depending on which witness testimony you believed, Marilyn died sometime between 10:30 p.m. on August 4th and 4:30 a.m. on August 5th, but the coroner wasn't called until after 4 a.m., and police didn't arrive until after 4:30 a.m., suggesting hours of delay. The physical evidence was compromised. Marilyn's stomach was almost completely empty during autopsy, despite the massive amount of barbiturates in her system, suggesting the drugs were not taken orally. Her home had been cleaned before police arrived, with evidence removed or rearranged. Phone records from that night mysteriously disappeared, and multiple witnesses reported seeing Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles that day, despite official denials. But the most significant detail is this: the complete screenplay that Marilyn had kept in her home, the 127-page script with her handwritten notes, was never found in the official inventory of her possessions. Her filing cabinets had been emptied. Her personal papers had been collected by parties unknown before police secured the scene, and the film treatment that FBI agents photographed on her nightstand disappeared from evidence within 48 hours and has never been recovered. The subsequent investigation focused entirely on Marilyn's mental health, her drug dependency, and her romantic disappointments. The arrangement project was never mentioned in any official capacity. Frank Sinatra refused to discuss it, claiming no knowledge of any such screenplay. Peter Lawford similarly denied awareness, and 20th Century Fox stated that Marilyn had proposed several projects, but nothing had been deemed viable. The script vanished as completely as if it had never existed, but pieces survived. In 1998, a storage unit containing materials from George Axelrod's estate was auctioned, and among the items was a partial treatment for an unnamed project featuring a movie star and a nightclub singer. In 2003, several pages that appeared to be from Marilyn's personal diary surfaced at auction, including an entry describing her work on a film that tells the truth about powerful men and the women they destroy. The diary pages were authenticated, but immediately challenged by the Monroe estate and withdrawn from sale, and in 2011, a former FBI agent gave a deathbed interview in which he claimed to have been part of a team that collected sensitive materials from Marilyn's home before police arrived, materials that were subsequently destroyed on orders that came from the highest levels of government. The agent specifically mentioned film scripts and personal writings that contained allegations about the president. The question that haunts Hollywood is not just what happened to the arrangement, but what might have happened if it had been made. If Marilyn had been allowed to tell her story, if Sinatra had stood with her, if studio executives had chosen artistic courage over political safety, would Marilyn Monroe have survived? The film represented more than a comeback opportunity. It represented control over her own narrative, a chance to be seen as something beyond a sex symbol, and most importantly, a purpose that might have given her reason to fight her demons. Friends who spoke with Marilyn in her final months consistently reported that her passion for the arrangement was unlike anything they had seen from her before. She wasn't just excited about a role, she was desperate to tell this story, convinced that it mattered, that it could help other women understand the systems that exploited them. Dr. Greenson's notes describe her talking about the film as my testimony and the truth that needs to be told. Without that project, without that purpose, Marilyn had nothing to live for. Her career was in ruins, her relationships had all failed, the studio had fired her, the Kennedys had abandoned her. Even Sinatra had withdrawn from her most important project. The arrangement was her last chance at redemption, and when it was taken away, she lost the will to keep fighting. But the legacy extends beyond Marilyn's personal tragedy. The arrangement represents a turning point in Hollywood's relationship with political power. In the years following Marilyn's death, American cinema became increasingly bold in its criticism of government. Films like The Manchurian Candidate, The Parallax View, and eventually All the President's Men would tell stories of government malfeasance that would have been unthinkable in the early 19th. The difference was that those films didn't name real people or depict actual events. They used fiction as a buffer. But the arrangement, as Marilyn conceived it, would have blurred that line completely. It would have been fiction that everyone recognized as fact, and that recognition would have made it impossible for the Kennedy administration, for organized crime figures, and for Hollywood studios to maintain their facade. The film was killed not because it wasn't commercially viable, it absolutely would have been a box office success, but because it was too true, too revealing, and too dangerous to the power structures that governed American public life. In that sense, Marilyn Monroe's death was not a suicide or an accidental overdose, but a murder by silence, a killing accomplished by denying her the ability to speak her truth in the medium that mattered most to her. Today, fragments of the arrangement continue to surface. Researchers have found references to the project in FBI files released under FOIA requests. Auction houses occasionally offer materials that claim connection to the script, though authentication remains difficult. And in Hollywood, the project has become a legendary what-if that filmmakers continue to reference. Several attempts have been made over the decades to reconstruct or create the arrangement based on available information, though none avoided the controversial political elements. But none of these reconstructions can capture what was lost when Marilyn's original screenplay disappeared. Her voice, her perspective, her testimony about what it meant to be a woman, used by powerful men and then discarded when she became inconvenient. That testimony, written in her own hand with her own experiences, translated into dramatic form, would have been one of the most important documents in 20th-century American cultural history. Its destruction, and make no mistake, it was destroyed deliberately by people who understood its power, represents a profound loss, not just for cinema, but for history itself. We will never know exactly what Marilyn wanted to say, how she understood her own exploitation, or what details she would have revealed about the famous men who shaped and destroyed her life. That silence, that absence is the real legacy of the arrangement, a reminder that even in America, even in Hollywood, some stories are too dangerous to tell, and some truths die with the people brave enough to speak them.